Before the first American landing craft appeared off the shore of his island, Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi sat down and wrote a letter to his wife. He did not write about tactics. He did not write about honor. He wrote about the enemy. Years before the war, Kuribayashi had lived in America. He had traveled across that country, visited its military bases, eaten with its officers, studied the way they trained and the way they thought. One of the officers he befriended during that time gave him a gift, an American pistol that Kuribayashi carried for the rest of his life. He came home to Japan with something no staff college lecture could replicate. He had first-hand knowledge of the people his country was preparing to fight. Kuribayashi's years in the United States had given him unusual first-hand familiarity with American society and military power, and his defense of Iwo Jima was explicitly designed to inflict the greatest possible casualties on the invading force. He knew what the Americans valued. He knew what they protected. He knew where their commitments would cost them blood, and he built his fortress around every one of those truths. But knowledge of the enemy, even knowledge this precise, was not enough, because if he understood this enemy so well, if he knew them better than any Japanese officer alive, then the question the rest of this story has to answer is the one his letters cannot. Why did he still lose? Kuribayashi understood nearly everything about the men who were coming for his island. He had seen their commitment firsthand. He had designed his defense around their psychology with more precision than any Japanese commander before him. He had anticipated almost every advantage they would bring and built his fortress to neutralize each one. He understood 6 of the 7 things that made United States Marines unlike any enemy Japan had ever faced. The 7th one killed him. But to understand the 7th, it is necessary to go back to the beginning. 3 years before Kuribayashi wrote those letters, to a different island, a different night, and a different officer who believed he already knew everything he needed to know about American Marines. To understand why each of these realizations landed so hard on the men who experienced them, it helps to understand what those men had been taught before the war began. Not what they believed as individuals, because individual belief varies and always has. What matters here is what the institution believed, because institutions train armies, and armies fight wars, and the institution that trained the Imperial Japanese military in the 1930s believed something very specific about the United States of America. Democracies, the doctrine held, produced comfortable citizens. Comfortable citizens enjoyed soft lives, and men who had grown up in soft lives did not want to die for a scattering of coral atolls that nobody back home had ever heard of, and nobody back home would ever visit. This was the foundation. Everything else was built on top of it. If the foundation was correct, then the math was simple. Inflict enough casualties quickly enough, make the price of every island high enough in American blood, and sooner or later Washington would calculate that the war was no longer worth fighting. Not because America lacked the power to continue, but because its people lacked the will. It was not simply prejudice dressed up as strategy, though prejudice was certainly present in the rooms where these lessons were taught. It was a specific, load-bearing assumption repeated in staff colleges from Tokyo to occupied Manchuria, tested against the evidence of 2 decades of Western colonial retreat across Asia, and accepted by an entire generation of officers as operational fact. The British had surrendered Singapore with 80,000 men still under arms. The Dutch East Indies had fallen in a matter of weeks. The American garrison on Bataan had held longer than expected, but it had surrendered too, and Corregidor after it. By the summer of 1942, There was not a single piece of evidence anywhere in the Pacific theater that suggested Western soldiers, trained in democracies, fed on comfort, were capable of standing against Japanese infantry in close combat and refusing to break. That was what Japanese officers believed. On the night of August 21, 1942, when the first of them tested it on Guadalcanal and discovered he was wrong. Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki was approximately 50 years old that night. He was a career infantry officer, a veteran of combat in China, a man who had spent his entire adult life inside the Japanese military system and had no reason to doubt it. He had studied the American landing on Guadalcanal in the days before his attack. He had observed their perimeter. He had assessed their equipment, and he had concluded, based on everything his training and experience told him, that a single determined night assault by his detachment of roughly 900 men would shatter the Marine positions, the way Japanese infantry had shattered colonial garrisons from Hong Kong to Java since December of 1941. He told his men it would not take long. In the first hour after midnight, they rose out of the sandgrass on the east bank of a shallow tidal creek called the Ilu River, though the Marines on the other side would mistakenly call it the Tenaru for the rest of the war and long after. They came screaming across the sandbar and into the water, firing as they ran, aiming for the muzzle flashes of the Marine positions dug in along the west bank. The Marines did not break. They did not fall back. They did not do any of the things Ichiki's training told him Western soldiers did when Japanese infantry came at them in the dark, with bayonets fixed and voices raised. They stayed in their holes, and they fired. They fired with rifles and machine guns, and when the Japanese infantry reached the near bank of the creek, they fired at ranges so close that the muzzle flash itself became a weapon, illuminating targets that were already dying before they understood what had gone wrong with the plan. By the end of the battle, Ichiki's roughly 900-man first echelon had been effectively destroyed, with more than 600 Japanese killed, according to official accounts, and only a small number captured. Ichiki himself did not survive. The exact manner of his death remains disputed. Some accounts say he was killed in the fighting. Others say he burned his regimental colours and took his own life after the assault collapsed. What is not disputed is that his confident prediction was wrong within a single night, and that the force he led was effectively destroyed before the sun came up. The reasonable response to this outcome would have been to reconsider the assumption that had produced it. Tokyo did not do this. Instead, Tokyo concluded that Ichiki had failed because his force was too small and sent a larger one. 3 weeks after Ichiki's destruction, Brigadier General Kiyotake Kawaguchi arrived on Guadalcanal with his 35th Brigade. Kawaguchi was approximately 50 years old, an experienced officer who had commanded forces in Borneo earlier in the war. He planned a more sophisticated attack than Ichiki's frontal charge, sending his main force through the jungle south of the American airfield to strike from an unexpected direction. On the night of September 12, 1942, Kawaguchi's men hit the ridge south of Henderson Field. The position was held by the 1st Raider Battalion and the 1st Parachute Battalion under Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson, a 45-year-old career Marine with red hair and a reputation for calm under fire that would earn him the nickname Red Mike. The ridge would later carry his name. Kawaguchi's men attacked in waves through the night, pressing close enough for hand-to-hand fighting on parts of the ridge. Edson's Marines gave ground in places, pulled back to tighter positions, and held. They held through the night and into the next day, and when it was over, Kawaguchi's brigade had been badly mauled and was withdrawing back into the jungle with nothing to show for the casualties it had taken. Kawaguchi's failed September attack added to the mounting evidence that Guadalcanal had become a disastrous battlefield for the Japanese army. The island that Tokyo had considered a minor outpost was consuming battalions and brigades at a rate that should have forced a reassessment of everything the General Staff believed about American fighting capability. But Tokyo continued committing additional forces in an effort to retake Henderson Field, because the alternative was to admit that the assumption underneath the entire Pacific strategy was wrong. Tokyo did not want to admit this. Tokyo was not finished trying. On the night of October 24, 1942, Lieutenant General Masao Maruyama tested the same assumption a third time with the largest force yet. Maruyama was approximately 53 years old, commander of the 2nd Sendai Division, one of Japan's most experienced infantry formations. His men had spent 2 weeks hauling artillery pieces through jungle so dense that pack animals died or had to be abandoned along the route that Japanese maps optimistically labeled the Maruyama Trail. By the time roughly 3,000 of his soldiers reached the American lines south of Henderson Field, they had lost most of their heavy weapons and a large share of their physical strength simply to the march itself. Maruyama sent them forward anyway, certain that numbers would finish what Ichiki and Kawaguchi had started. At the center of the American line stood 2 machine gun sections from the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines. The man responsible for those guns was a 25-year-old sergeant from Raritan, New Jersey, named John Basilone. He was not an officer. He was not a strategist. He was a machine gunner who had joined the Marines after a previous enlistment in the army, and on this particular night, he was the man standing between Maruyama's infantry and the airfield behind him. When the guns on his flank fell silent because their crews had been killed or wounded, Basilone left his own position under fire, crossed open ground to the abandoned gun, and worked it alone until replacements could reach him. When ammunition ran low, he did not wait for it to be brought forward. He carried it himself, under fire, across ground that was being swept by Japanese rifle and machine gun fire from multiple directions. This is not the language of heroism. This is the language of a man doing exactly what Marine training taught every Marine to do. When the gun stops firing, get to the gun. When the ammunition runs out, get more ammunition. Do not wait for someone to tell you. Do not wait for conditions to improve. The gun needs to fire, and you are the man closest to the gun, so you move. Waves of Japanese infantry hit that stretch of line for most of 2 days. They kept coming long after the sound alone should have told any rational officer that the position could not be taken by adding more bodies to the approach. The volume of fire was continuous. The ground in front of the Marine positions was carpeted with the dead and the dying, and still they came, because the assumption said the Marines would break, and the assumption could not be wrong, because the assumption was the foundation of everything. Across the entire perimeter, close to 3,000 of Maruyama's soldiers were dead or dying by the time the assault broke. On the stretch of line where the fighting was thickest, the position had been held, at its worst hour, by little more than 2 machine guns, and the sergeant who refused to let either one stop firing. The October attacks demonstrated once more that determined Japanese assaults could inflict heavy casualties, but could not force the Marines from the Henderson Field perimeter. The pattern was now unmistakable to anyone willing to read it honestly. The Marines absorbed the assault, held their ground, and were still there when the sun came up. 3 major Japanese efforts on Guadalcanal had failed in succession. Ichiki's understrength first echelon, Kawaguchi's larger September attack, the much larger October offensive involving elements of the 2nd Division. Japanese commanders repeatedly underestimated American strength and continued trying to retake Henderson Field despite mounting losses. This was the pattern that would repeat across the Pacific for the next 3 years. Not the failure itself, but the refusal to learn from it. The second thing was less about courage than arithmetic, and arithmetic frightened Japanese planners more than almost anything else in the war. Because arithmetic cannot be outfought and cannot be outbelieved, and does not care how much spirit you bring to the battle. Rear Admiral Keiji Shibasaki was approximately 49 years old when he took command of the garrison on Batio, the main island of the Tarawa atoll in the Gilbert Islands. Batio was a sandbar. It was smaller than Central Park in New York. And Shibasaki, together with his engineers and more than 1,000 conscripted Korean laborers, had spent nearly a year turning that sandbar into one of the most heavily fortified pieces of ground in the entire Pacific Ocean. Heavy coastal defense guns, including 8-inch weapons originally designed for naval use, hundreds of machine gun positions, each with interlocking fields of fire that covered every approach to every beach. Bunkers with walls built from reinforced concrete and coconut logs, thick enough to shrug off direct hits from naval shells. Anti-boat obstacles in the water. Mines on the reef. Steel tetrahedrons on the beach. Every square meter of Betio's shoreline had been engineered to kill anyone who tried to cross it. Shibasaki was reported to have told his garrison that 1,000,000 men could not take Tarawa in 100 years. The assault began on the 20th of November, 1943, and the tide was against the attackers before the first shot was fired. Intelligence had warned that the water over the reef might be too shallow for the Higgins boats that were supposed to carry the Marines to shore. The warning was correct. Low water left the coral reef surrounding Betio exposed at exactly the wrong depth, too shallow for the flat-bottomed landing craft to cross, too deep for men carrying full combat loads to simply walk. The boats ground to a halt on the reef several hundred yards from the beach. Marines climbed out of stalled craft and began wading towards shore chest deep. Rifles held overhead with both hands. Moving at the speed a man moves when he is pushing through waist-deep water, carrying 60 pounds of gear and ammunition on his body. The machine guns opened fire from 3 directions at once. The lagoon turned into a killing ground, measured afterward, at close to 500 meters of open water, with no cover of any kind. Men went under and did not come back up, dragged down by packs and ammunition belts they did not have time to shed. Others were hit and fell forward into the water, and drowned in less than 2 feet of depth because they could not lift themselves with the wounds they had taken. Survivors would call that stretch of open water simply the Long Walk In. There was no other name that fit. It took not 100 years, but 76 hours. Not 1,000,000 men, but 18,000. Shibasaki himself was killed on the first afternoon, likely by a naval shell that struck his command bunker, though the exact circumstances of his death remain uncertain. When the fighting ended, only 17 of his roughly 4,500 defenders remained alive to surrender. The rest were dead, nearly all of them. On the American side, more than 1,000 Marines were killed and more than 2,000 wounded in less than 3 days. The photographs of their bodies, floating in the shallows of the lagoon and lying in rows on the narrow beach, were among the first graphic combat images released to the American public during the war. They provoked outrage, not at the Japanese but at the American commanders who had ordered the assault. Congressmen demanded investigations. Newspaper editorials questioned whether islands like Tarawa were worth the price. For a brief period, it looked as though the very thing Japanese doctrine predicted might actually happen. The American public might recoil from the cost and demand that the advance stop. It did not happen. What happened instead was the opposite, and this was the part that frightened Japanese planners more than the battle itself. The United States looked at Tarawa and treated it as an engineering problem. The tide was wrong, so they developed better reef-crossing vehicles. The bombardment was too short, so they extended pre-invasion shelling from hours to days. The intelligence was incomplete, so they built better reconnaissance protocols. The coordination between naval gunfire and ground troops broke down, so they redesigned the communication systems from the waterline to the front line. 10 weeks after Tarawa, Marines assaulted Roy Namur in the Kwajalein Atoll. The fortifications were comparable. The defenders were dug in. The result was not comparable at all. Casualties dropped dramatically. The lessons written in blood on BTO's reef had been studied, absorbed, and converted into new standard operating procedures in less than 3 months. And behind the tactical adaptation sat a deeper reality that no amount of Japanese fighting spirit could change. Japan's wartime economy was, by most estimates, less than 1/6 the size of America's. The United States possessed an industrial and training system vastly larger than Japan's, allowing it to replace ships, aircraft, equipment, and trained personnel on a scale Japan increasingly could not match, although American losses still imposed real operational and human costs. Every aircraft carrier Japan lost was gone permanently. Every trained pilot killed was replaced, if replaced at all, by someone with fewer flight hours and less combat experience. Every seasoned infantry regiment destroyed on a Pacific island left a gap in the order of battle that Japanese manpower could not fill. The United States could absorb losses that would have crippled Japan's war effort, not because those losses were painless, but because the system behind the front line could regenerate what the front line consumed. By the later stages of the war, Japanese naval and military leaders had been forced to confront an American capacity to replace ships, aircraft, trained personnel, and materiel on a scale Japan could no longer approach. The war they had started on the assumption that American willpower would crack before American industry was tested had become a war against a production system that treated every loss as a problem to be solved rather than a wound to be endured. Between Guadalcanal and Tarawa sat the same discovery, reached by men on different islands who never met each other. The enemy they had been trained to despise was not soft. The country behind that enemy was not fragile, and the assumption that enough blood would break the American will to fight was not a strategy. It was a prayer. Tarawa should have been the proof. The American public saw the photographs, read the casualty lists, heard the congressional outrage. Everything the doctrine predicted should have followed from that moment. The advance should have stalled. The negotiations should have begun. The comfortable democracy should have decided that a sandbar in the middle of the Pacific was not worth 1,000 dead young men. Instead, the engineers went to work. The tacticians went to work. The shipyards went to work. And 10 weeks later, the Marines came back, and this time they did not wade. The third thing followed from the second, though it took Japanese command longer to accept, because it looked at first like a weakness rather than a strength. American forces would risk healthy men and lose some of them to save wounded ones again and again, even when the rescue carried no tactical value at all. This is where Kuribayashi returns to the story. By 1944, he had been assigned to defend Iwo Jima, and he carried with him the understanding he had gained during his years in America. Not just the American pistol given to him by an officer he had once called a friend, the deeper understanding. The knowledge that the Americans valued their men in a way that created both a strength and a vulnerability. If Americans would not abandon their wounded, then Americans could be made to bleed for every yard of ground they tried to cross. Every man who fell in the open would draw another man out to reach him, and that man could be shot too, and the man after him, and the chain would continue, because the Americans would not do the rational thing and leave their wounded where they fell. He turned that understanding into a weapon. If they would not leave their wounded, he would make sure there were wounded everywhere. And Japanese riflemen had already watched it happen on the coral ridges above Peleliu's invasion beaches in September of 1944. Naval bombardment had barely touched the caves cut into those ridges. The Japanese garrison had waited inside them while the shells fell, and when the shelling stopped and the Marines began crossing the open ground below, the defenders opened fire from positions that the heaviest guns in the American fleet had not been able to reach. Marines fell in the open, and from inside those caves, Japanese defenders watched something they had no framework to understand. American Navy corpsmen crawled forward into the fire. They carried no weapon of their own. They carried morphine and bandages and nothing else. They crossed open ground that was being swept by aimed rifle fire to reach Marines who had gone down, and they did this knowing exactly what was likely to happen to them, because they had watched it happen to other corpsmen earlier the same afternoon. Some of them were hit doing this more than once in a single day, and went back out regardless, bandaged and bleeding, and still carrying their medical kits toward the next man who was down. At Peleliu, Navy corpsmen repeatedly exposed themselves to enemy fire to treat and evacuate wounded Marines. Japanese fire struck corpsmen, stretcher teams, and wounded men alike. The risks built into the American system of battlefield medical care were extraordinary by any military standard, and they reflected a commitment to the individual soldier that Japanese doctrine simply did not share. In the Japanese military, a soldier who could no longer fight had no further value worth risking a healthy man to preserve. The Americans operated on the exact opposite principle, and they paid for it in blood every time a corpsman crawled into the open to reach a man who was down. This was what Kuribayashi had understood, before anyone had to explain it to him. He had seen it in peacetime, in the way American officers talked about their men, in the way American bases were organized, in the small details that most visiting foreign officers overlooked, because they were looking for weapons and tactics rather than culture. Kuribayashi was looking at culture, and what he saw told him that the Americans would pay a price for their wounded that no Japanese commander would ever ask his own men to pay. But there was something Kuribayashi did not yet understand, and it would take the next three things before the shape of his miscalculation became clear. The fourth thing struck at something Japanese officers considered close to sacred, not a tactic, not a formation. A belief about how armies work at the most fundamental level, a belief so deeply embedded in Japanese military thinking that questioning it was almost the same as questioning whether armies could function at all. The belief was this: an army's fighting spirit flows downward from its commanders. The officer thinks. The officer decides. The officer leads. The men follow. Remove the officer, and you remove the brain from the body, and what remains is not an army, but a collection of frightened individuals who will, within minutes, begin behaving like what they are. Civilians in uniform, men who were never trained to think for themselves on a battlefield, because thinking was never their job. It was not an unreasonable theory. It described with considerable accuracy how most conscript armies in recorded history had actually behaved when their officers were killed. It described how large parts of Japan's own army behaved because Japanese infantry training concentrated tactical initiative almost entirely in commissioned officers. A Japanese platoon with its lieutenant alive was one of the most dangerous small units in the Pacific War. A Japanese platoon with its lieutenant dead was, in a meaningful number of documented cases, a unit that ceased to function as a coordinated fighting force within minutes. Japanese officers understood this about their own system and assumed it applied universally. If their own soldiers could not function without officers, then surely soldiers raised in a democracy, men who had been drafted out of civilian jobs and given a few months of training before being shipped across an ocean, would be even more dependent on their chain of command. Kill the lieutenants and the sergeants and the corporals, and the marines below them would mill and cluster and eventually stop moving forward, because nobody would be left to tell them where forward was. This assumption arrived at Iwo Jima in February of 1945 and died there. Iwo Jima is a volcanic island, roughly 8 square miles in total area, shaped like a pork chop, dominated at its southern tip by the cone of Mount Suribachi and across its northern plateau by a landscape of ridges, ravines, and sulphurous rock that smelled like the inside of a machine and felt, under the boots of the men who fought across it, like walking on ground that was not entirely solid. The sand on the invasion beaches was black, not grey, not dark brown, black volcanic ash that swallowed men's boots to the ankle and offered no traction at all, so that every step forward required effort, and every man moving across it moved slowly and was visible against the dark sand from every elevation above. Kuribayashi had prepared for this invasion with more care and more intelligence than any Japanese commander before him. He had studied Tarawa. He had studied Peleliu. He had absorbed the lesson that other garrisons had paid for with their lives, and he had concluded that the old methods, beach defense, banzai charges, glorious death in the first hours, were not strategies. They were waste. His orders to the garrison were explicit. There would be no banzai charges on Iwo Jima, no massed frontal assaults, no theatrical displays of courage designed to impress the enemy or satisfy the honor of men who were going to die, regardless of how they died. Every soldier's duty was to survive as long as possible and kill as many Americans as possible before dying. Not for glory, for arithmetic. He had built more than 11 miles of tunnels connecting over 1,500 fortified positions across the island. Pillboxes with walls of reinforced concrete 3 feet thick. Blockhouses sunk into the volcanic rock with only their firing slits visible above ground. Cave systems with multiple entrances and exits, so that a position could be abandoned under fire and reoccupied from a different direction after the attackers had moved past. Ventilation shafts angled to disperse the blast of explosives dropped into tunnel mouths, water cisterns, ammunition stores, underground chambers deep enough to shelter men from the heaviest naval bombardment the American fleet could deliver. The Marines of the 3rd, 4th, and 5th Divisions hit the beaches on the morning of February 19, 1945. American commanders had expected the island to be secured within a week, perhaps 10 days at most. It took 36 days of continuous fighting, and by the time it was over, nearly 7,000 Marines were dead, and approximately 20,000 more were wounded. Of the roughly 21,000 Japanese soldiers defending the island under Kuribayashi's command, only a few hundred were still alive to be taken prisoner when the guns finally stopped. Those are the numbers. What matters here is what happened between the numbers, because what happened between the numbers is what destroyed the 4th assumption. On the black sand of the invasion beaches and across the broken volcanic ridges above them, Japanese defenders followed Kuribayashi's strategy exactly as designed. They waited for the Marines to advance into prepared kill zones. They fired from concealed positions. And among the first targets they selected, consistently, deliberately, across every sector of the island, were the men giving orders. Officers were identifiable by their posture, their gestures, the way other men oriented toward them. Senior sergeants were identifiable by the same signals. Japanese riflemen and machine gunners had been specifically instructed to watch for these men and kill them first, because doctrine said that killing them would stop the attack. It did not stop the attack. On Iwo Jima, Japanese defenders targeted exposed leaders whenever they could identify them. Officers were shot. Senior sergeants were shot. In sector after sector, the men who were visibly giving orders went down in the opening minutes of every assault. And according to everything Japanese doctrine predicted, what should have followed was confusion, hesitation, a visible loss of coordination, and then either retreat or the kind of aimless forward movement that could be broken apart by sustained fire from fixed positions. What happened instead was that Marine units continued fighting after officers, and senior non-commissioned officers became casualties, with junior leaders assuming responsibility as circumstances demanded. The platoons that lost their lieutenants in the first minutes did not stop. The squads that lost their sergeants did not cluster and wait for instructions that were never coming. Men whose rank could not be identified through binoculars, because they carried no visible insignia of authority in combat, took over and resumed the assault in a direction, and with a coherence that suggested the loss of every leader the unit had started with had changed nothing about the unit's understanding of what it was supposed to do. Japanese defenders, watching from fortified positions above the beaches, saw units that should have lost their ability to function continue to function. They saw platoons reorganize under men who appeared to hold no rank at all and resume attacks within minutes. They saw what their training told them was structurally impossible. An army without visible command that was neither a mob nor, by any definition their doctrine gave them, an army that should still have been fighting. The ability of junior Marines to assume responsibility after leaders became casualties helped units continue operating under severe battlefield disruption. The degree of cohesion varied from unit to unit and situation to situation, because war is not a laboratory and not every platoon held together the same way. But the pattern was consistent enough and visible enough that it contradicted the core Japanese assumption about how democratic armies functioned under fire. This was not an accident of individual grit. It was not a fluke produced by one unusually brave corporal who happened to pick up where his lieutenant left off. It was the direct product of a training philosophy built deliberately in the years before the war. In the years before the war, the Marine Corps had constructed its infantry training around a single assumption that was the exact mirror image of the Japanese assumption. The Marines assumed that officers would die. They assumed that radios would fail. They assumed that communication would break down, that plans would become irrelevant the moment the first shot was fired, and that a 19-year-old private first class might become the senior man alive on a stretch of beach 50 yards wide, with no orders coming from anywhere and no way to request them. And so they trained every Marine, not just the officers, not just the sergeants, but every rifleman and every machine gunner and every ammunition carrier to know the objective. Not to know the plan, because plans die with the men who made them. To know the objective. The bunker on the left, the ridge 200 yards ahead, the blockhouse covering the intersection. Every man in a Marine rifle squad knew where the squad was supposed to end up. and that knowledge did not depend on any single person remaining alive to repeat it. Japanese infantry training did the opposite. It concentrated initiative, decision-making, and tactical judgment almost entirely in commissioned officers, with senior non-commissioned officers serving as enforcers of the officer's will rather than as independent tactical thinkers. This made Japanese units extraordinarily effective for as long as their officers survived. A Japanese officer leading a night assault was a formidable thing because every man behind him knew exactly what he wanted and followed with absolute discipline. But it also made Japanese units brittle in the exact moment their officers did not survive, because the men who remained had never been trained to answer the question that every Marine was trained to answer from the first week of boot camp. What do I do when nobody is left to tell me what to do? The Marine answer was simple. You already know what to do. You were told the objective before the assault began. Move toward it. If the man next to you goes down, keep moving. If every man with rank goes down, keep moving. The objective has not changed because the men who assigned it are dead. The bunker is still there. The ridge is still there. Go. It was not courage in the way that word is usually used. It was design. And it was the one thing in the entire Pacific War that Japanese military doctrine had no mechanism to defeat. Because you cannot behead a command structure that has been deliberately built without a single head to cut. The fifth thing contradicted everything Japanese civilians on Okinawa had been told to expect, and history has remembered it less than almost anything else that happened in the Pacific War. This is not because it was unimportant. It is because it does not fit cleanly into the story that either side preferred to tell afterward, and uncomfortable truths that belong to no one's preferred narrative tend to be the first ones forgotten. Through the spring of 1945, as American forces closed on the Japanese home islands, the military authorities on Okinawa circulated a specific message among the island's civilian population. The message was simple, and it was terrifying. American Marines, the villagers were told, tortured prisoners without exception. They murdered, captured civilians without distinction. Surrender to the Americans was not merely dangerous, it was a fate worse than death, and any Okinawan who allowed himself or his family to be taken alive would suffer things that no Japanese subject should be forced to imagine. This was not casual propaganda. It was an organized campaign delivered through military police, local officials, and soldiers garrisoned among the civilian population. It was repeated in schools, in village meetings, in the caves where families had been told to shelter when the invasion came. And it was effective, not because the Okinawan people were gullible, but because they had no competing source of information. They had never met an American. They had no radio contact with the outside world. The only authority they knew was the Japanese military authority that controlled every aspect of life on the island, and that authority told them with absolute certainty that the Americans were coming to kill them all. In the caves of southern Okinawa, that message produced exactly what it was designed to produce: mass suicides among families who believed they had no other choice. Mothers killed their children and then themselves. Fathers used rocks and ropes and whatever was available because firearms were scarce among civilians. In some caves, Japanese soldiers sheltering alongside civilian families handed them grenades to make the process faster and more certain. The number of Okinawan civilians who died during the battle, from combat, from suicide, from starvation, from disease, is estimated at somewhere between 40,000 and 150,000, depending on the source and the methodology, out of a pre-war population of roughly 300,000. No number in that range is anything but catastrophic. What happened next is the part that does not fit neatly into any preferred narrative, which is precisely why it matters. Civilians who did emerge from those caves, trembling, expecting the torture and murder they had been promised, found something that bore no resemblance to what they had been told. In case after documented case, they found Marines who gave them food, Marines who treated their wounds, Marines who, in a number of recorded incidents, physically pulled people back from cliff edges to stop suicides that were already underway. Men who had been fighting and killing Japanese soldiers for weeks, who had watched their own friends die on the ridges above those caves, who had every reason to be brutal and no superior officer watching to prevent it, chose instead to carry water to terrified families and bandage the injuries of children who screamed at the sight of them. This is not a claim that the American military behaved perfectly on Okinawa or anywhere else in the Pacific. It did not. Atrocities occurred in this war on both sides, and no honest account of any campaign in the Pacific pretends otherwise. Individual acts of cruelty, murder, and abuse are documented throughout the theatre, committed by men wearing every uniform involved in the conflict. But the specific claim that surrender to American Marines meant certain death, the claim that had been delivered to Okinawan civilians as established fact by Japanese military authorities, was demonstrably and repeatedly false. Japanese propaganda had taught many Okinawan civilians to fear capture by American forces, and documented encounters after capture sometimes sharply contradicted those warnings. Civilians in American custody received food, medical care, clothing, and shelter in military government camps. The gap between what they had been told to expect and what they actually experienced was, for those who survived long enough to experience it, total. And some of the men who had helped spread the original propaganda acknowledged this after the war. Once there was no longer any authority left to punish them for telling the truth. The enemy they had described to terrified villagers did not match the enemy they saw with their own eyes. This was the cruelest of the seven things, not because of what the Marines did, but because of what the lie cost. Families died in those caves because they believed the propaganda more than they feared the act of killing their own children. The truth arrived too late for them. It arrived only for the ones who hesitated long enough, or were too weak to act on their fear quickly enough, or simply ran out of grenades before every family member was dead. Those were the ones who walked out and discovered that the thing they had been told to fear more than death was a 19-year-old from somewhere in the American Midwest holding out a canteen. The sixth thing lived inside men's heads rather than in after-action reports, which made it harder to document but did not make it less real. Japanese officers wrote about it anyway, on island after island, because it unsettled them deeply enough that they needed to try to explain it even when their own vocabulary gave them no adequate words. Japanese military doctrine held a specific assumption about motivation. Soldiers raised in a democracy, drafted out of civilian lives rather than trained from childhood to consider death in the emperor's service a form of spiritual fulfillment, would fight with less total commitment than soldiers raised under the Japanese system. They might fight well enough when the odds were favorable. They might even fight bravely when cornered. But they would not sustain the kind of absolute, self-destroying commitment that the Japanese system produced, because democratic societies did not cultivate that kind of commitment. Democratic societies cultivated the desire to survive and return home, and at some point that desire would override everything else. What Japanese officers observed instead, island after island, year after year, was a different kind of commitment entirely. It was not aimed upward, toward a government or a flag or an emperor or any abstraction large enough to be printed on a poster. It was aimed sideways, toward the 3 or 4 men standing within arm's reach. American Marines did not appear to fight for Washington. They did not appear to fight for the president, or for democracy, or for any principle that could be articulated in a recruiting slogan. They fought for each other. The man on their left, the man on their right. The man who shared their foxhole the night before, and who would share it again tonight, if both of them were still alive when the sun went down. And that loyalty, small and personal and entirely unofficial, proved in practice to be at least as unbreakable as anything the Japanese system produced with its lifetime of institutional conditioning, its emperor worship, its spiritual preparation for death. The Marines were not prepared for death. They were prepared for something smaller and, as it turned out, more durable. They were prepared to not leave. Survivors who wrote about combat afterward almost never described what they felt as courage. That word belongs to people who were not there. The men who were there described something different. A narrowing, a tunnel, a state in which the war outside their own fire team briefly ceased to exist, and the entire universe contracted to a space roughly 10 feet wide, containing the only people who mattered. Nobody in the Pacific War demonstrated this more completely than the same sergeant who had held the line south of Henderson Field 2.5 years earlier. After Guadalcanal, John Basilone came home to everything the United States could offer a living hero: a Medal of Honor, a war bond tour, crowds and handshakes, and a girl in every city, and the absolute guarantee that he would never have to set foot on another island or hear another shot fired for the rest of the war. He was 26 years old. He had already done more than any reasonable country could ask of any single man. The Marine Corps was perfectly willing to keep him stateside, smiling for cameras and selling bonds, for as long as the war lasted. He turned it down. He asked to return to a combat unit. The request was denied. He asked again. It was denied again. He kept asking. Eventually, the Marine Corps let him go, because there is a limit to how long you can tell a man who has earned the Medal of Honor that he does not have the right to go back to the men he trained. He was assigned to the 27th Marines, 5th Marine Division. He spent months training replacements, the next generation of machine gunners, who would go where he had already been. And when the 5th Division shipped out for Iwo Jima, Basilone went with them. He landed on the black sand on the morning of February 19, 1945, the same beaches where Kuribayashi's garrison was waiting, the same black volcanic ash that swallowed boots and offered no cover, the same interlocking fields of fire that had been designed to kill as many men as possible in the first hours of the landing. On Iwo Jima, Basilone moved off the exposed beach under heavy fire, attacked and destroyed a Japanese blockhouse that was holding up his unit, and helped his Marines advance inland. Shortly afterward, an enemy artillery or mortar explosion killed Basilone and several Marines near him. He was 28 years old. Basilone did not die for the flag. He did not die for the president. He did not die for democracy, or for any word large enough to fit on a monument. He died because he had been given the chance to be safe, and he could not take it while the men he had trained were not safe. That was the entire calculation. That was the entire motivation. And it was the one thing that no Japanese military academy had ever taught its officers to anticipate, because it did not come from an institution or an ideology or a training manual. It came from a place so small and so ordinary that it did not have a name in any language spoken by the men trying to defeat it. It came from not being able to leave. If frontal beach defense failed, and it had failed on every island where it was tried. If massed banzai charges failed, and they had failed so completely that the men who ordered them were remembered not for their courage, but for their waste. If killing officers did not stop the assault, and it did not. If propaganda did not prevent surrender, and it did not. Then the answer, the only answer left, was to stop fighting the way Japanese doctrine said to fight and start fighting in a way that made the enemy's greatest strengths irrelevant. Stop defending the beach. Let them land. Let them cross the reef and wade through the lagoon and climb out of their boats onto dry ground without opposition. Let them believe, for the first hours, that the bombardment worked, that the garrison is dead, that this island will be easier than the last one. Then kill them from the inside. Colonel Kunio Nakagawa was approximately 46 years old when he received orders to defend Peleliu in the Palau Islands in the late summer of 1944. He was not the highest-ranking officer the Japanese military had ever assigned to a coral island in the middle of the Pacific. He was something more useful than that. He was a man who had studied what happened to every garrison that tried to hold a beach against American naval gunfire and American Marines, and who had concluded, correctly, that the beach was the wrong place to die. Peleliu's terrain gave him something no previous garrison commander had possessed in equal measure. The Amur-Brogul Massif, a jagged spine of coral ridges running through the island's center, was honeycombed with natural caves and could be engineered into a fortress that no amount of shelling from the sea could reach. Nakagawa's engineers spent months turning that spine into a defensive system unlike anything the Marines had encountered before. Nakagawa's defenders exploited hundreds of natural and improved caves, tunnels, bunkers, and mutually supporting strongpoints throughout the Amur-Brogul terrain, many positioned on reverse slopes or deep enough to survive much of the American naval and aerial bombardment. Firing positions were built with overlapping fields of fire, so that attacking one position exposed the attackers to fire from 2 or 3 others. Exit tunnels allowed defenders to abandon a position under assault, move underground, and reappear behind the attackers, or reoccupy the same position after the Americans had moved past it. Nakagawa abandoned the shoreline almost entirely. He placed minimal forces on the beaches, enough to slow the landing, but not enough to waste trained soldiers in a fight he knew he could not win at the water's edge. His real defense began inland, in the ridges, in the rock, in the dark. American commanders predicted the island would fall in 4 days. The 1st Marine Division landed on September 15, 1944, and the battle lasted more than 2 months. The Marines who fought on Peleliu encountered a kind of warfare that nothing in their experience had prepared them for. There were no lines to advance against. There were no positions to overrun in a single assault. There were only caves that fired and went silent, and fired again, from a different opening, ridges that could be taken and held, and still receive fire from positions that should have been behind them, and a heat so extreme that casualties from dehydration and heat exhaustion rivaled casualties from enemy fire in the first weeks. The Amur-Brogul, which the Marines renamed Bloody Nose Ridge, consumed rifle companies the way Tarawa's Reef had consumed landing craft. Units went into the ridges at full strength and came out days later at half strength or less, having advanced distances measured in yards rather than miles. The 1st Marine Division suffered a casualty rate above 50% before the island was secured. Peleliu remains, in the Marine Corps' own official history, among the costliest battles the Corps ever fought when measured by casualties per man engaged. Nakagawa's defense worked exactly as designed. For weeks it worked. The caves absorbed punishment that would have destroyed any surface position. The interconnected tunnels allowed defenders to appear, fire, vanish, and reappear somewhere the Marines had already cleared. The overlapping fields of fire meant that every advance was paid for in blood from directions the advancing men could not always identify. And then the Marines adapted again. Marine combat engineers stopped trying to assault cave mouths directly, because direct assault against a fortified cave with interlocking fields of fire was a method of dying that accomplished nothing except adding to the casualty list. Instead, they began sealing caves, explosives packed into the openings, flamethrowers that could reach around corners and into spaces that rifle fire could never touch. Tanks fitted with flame projectors that burned defenders out of positions that had survived every other weapon brought against them. Combat teams developed a systematic method. Isolate one cave system from the network, cut its connection to water, cut its connection to ammunition, cover every exit with fire, and then wait, not assault. Wait. Let time and thirst and the mathematics of a sealed system do what bullets could not. It was slower than Nakagawa had feared, and it was more total than anything he had planned for. His defense was designed to make the island expensive. It succeeded, but it was also designed to make the island so expensive that the Americans would stop coming. In that, it failed, because the same force